Okay. All right. So I'm going to invite in now Chris McMurray for the next hour. He's going to present on the new responsibilities for leaders and the EduJedi digital learning experience standards, as well as the new instructional design model. And hopefully there'll be a little bit of time at the end for us to discuss it a bit. But Chris, I'm going to have you over to you, and then also give you command of the
mouse control.
Yes, you're going to have mouse control.
Fantastic. That's just what I'm after. Everyone wants that, right?
Everyone wants mouse control.
Who doesn't want mouse control?
Yeah, it's mouse control is awesome. Okay, good. Perfect. So over to you.
Okay, here I am. So this is a great discussion. I as I was listening in on the various presentations today, what I appreciate is that we are including a focus on leadership, and that's kind of the crux of my the information that I'm going to share today, and hopefully get some input and feedback from folks. But it is critical. I was thinking about Krista Phillips' conversation about some of those matrices that he has to help to track and monitor and catalyze change. And one of the things that sort of perked my ears up a little bit was leadership preparedness. And I think that's an area that we, in our fervor to put in the right tools and to bring in the right teaching and the adult learning and things like that, every now and then we skip over the critical nature of our leadership and how prepared they are to help move this forward. And that includes teacher leadership, right? It includes leadership at all the levels. So my name is Chris McMurray, and I'm part of the EduJedi leadership culture, and so what we've been working on with the Learning Council and in my career as a chief academic officer and as a teacher in the classroom, really working toward creating that experiential type of a structure and structures that support experience and experience design. So what I'm going to do is lead us through a discussion about some background and some context on where we are today and how we may have gotten to this place, and then move to a set of standards and some frameworks that will help us to understand what some of the new responsibilities for leadership are, and how we can help to start thinking about that and move forward. So when we're talking about digital literacy, this is really something bigger, right? What we're really talking about is learning experience and being designers of that learning experience and being cognitive in terms of developing that sort of stuff, and where our learners are going and where they're taking themselves, maybe more importantly, and how we're setting those things up. And it's primarily because we have access to a much richer and nonlinear set of resources, and that really helps us to build. Those are great building blocks for experience. And so to think of it as that, one of the things that I always like to point out with folks is that as a teacher or a facilitator of learning, you're really supposed to be planning and designing for learning versus planning for teaching, because that's a subtle shift, right? But it's something that we have to be mindful of as educators and sort of leaders of learning. So I'm going to start with this diagram, and this is some information that is critical for leaders to know. This is all stuff that teacher leaders need to know. This is stuff that your chief academic officer needs to know. Your C&I team, your IT person needs to understand a lot of this stuff. So I'm going to sort of zip through some of these artifacts, because this is background information, and you'll want to put this in your back pocket. It's all available online in the EduJedi dictionary, though. So this is actually a scale. This was developed by the Learning Council in conjunction with a bunch of educators, and it's not brand new, but this is really an attempt to help folks understand the scale of digital curriculum and the characteristics that go within that, and why it's important to understand that. So going from left to right, you see at the very bottom, there's the digital document level. That would be like a Google Doc. It would be like a Word doc. It doesn't do anything. It just sort of is. And it might be great information, but it's not interactive, right? It's a one-way type of a resource. And you see at the top that we've got more instructional planning versus more automated learning, and we're going to go toward the right as we get toward that automated learning. So we jump up to single loop animations, and this might be like things sliding in on a PowerPoint or a slide deck, things blending in. It's just very simple. It's not really intended to do much more than create some interest, and maybe marginally at that. All the way up to video and collections. And video is where you start to experience, as we move up the scale, you start to experience more control as a learner, because with video, then all of a sudden, this is something that the teacher has recorded. It allows the end user to move forward and backwards. You can pause, you can replay, you can do all those things that help you understand the content. And that's a kind of a big shift from that digital document, because now all of a sudden you can do something with this and you're interacting with it in a way. And then we get to collections, and collections are really where you start to see bits of information being grouped. And we're going to go into that a little bit further in the next diagram that I'm going to share with you. But this is a sort of a defining line right here when we go from collections into feedback, because while collections is information contextualized that can be navigated within, when we move into the feedback sort of a level, the feedback level is really pretty remarkable and important, because it becomes two-way then, and all of a sudden, the resources that I'm using as a learner, that I as a teacher have planned for the learners to use, that software, those resources are now starting to take off some load from me as the teacher for providing feedback and immediate feedback and answering questions, things like that. And that's a defining line, because as soon as we tip over into that, we're trotting down the path toward more automated learning, and we're easing up some of the weight that our teachers feel. And, if you've been in a classroom when all of this stuff started happening and we began the transformation to digital, that felt heavy. And I remember it as a classroom teacher, it felt heavy and we couldn't identify it. It was hard to identify. But the more automation we can start using and leveraging that technology, I think that the less heavy that's going to feel. And then we move into coding, and this version of coding at this level right above feedback is really sort of the amateur level coding, not in a bad way, but it's it's not so sophisticated. It might be a web page or a website that has been coded or designed by the teacher. It allows for the learners to sort of move and modulate within that environment, and so that's what we mean by that. But again, look, we're adding some learner capacity and agency for making decisions about their own learning, and that's important. All the way up to the highly designed digital courseware level, and this is where you start to see whole worlds are created around content, and it's different content within the same environment, and there's an ecosystem built to help a learner to move themselves through with guidance through a learning experience, and it's much more experiential. So that's important, because as you start to use and suggest and purchase and implement resources, it's important to know where those exist within this scale and this spectrum, because if you're loading your ecosystem with resources that end up on the left-hand side, then you're automatically adding load. And that load becomes overwhelming. It just does, and we all know that from our experiences in the classroom. So that's the one piece that I want to share. Moving from that, then, is another scale. This is actually in that special report that's thumbnailed up there. It's again not brand new, but it's certainly something that you want to add to your understanding. This is how learning objects can be evaluated. And so again, we're going from at some sort of levels of atomization or granularity. And so we begin at the top with more amateur authorware. And this would be at the most granular level, just at the concept level. This would be bits and pieces of information. And they might be discrete pieces of information around a topic, and maybe a subtopic within a larger content area. And it just is, again, like the digital document level, it just is, it exists solely for itself, and it doesn't connect with anything else. And as you move up toward courses, you start to contextualize those bits, and all of a sudden the bits start to make sense within the sort of the company of other pieces of information, to start to build a bigger picture. And then we jump into ebooks, right? And courses. And these are things that can be created by an amateur coder. It could be a teacher who's creating ebooks who've done it, right? And those are really, they're very portable. And they begin to move up from that contextualization into something that's a little bit more interactive. So the next leap then into the professionally coded side would be the applet or app, and that's sort of the equivalent of that concept level, right? That's the professionally coded bit, and that app has one purpose, right? It's a math app, and it does math facts, or it's spelling, or it's whatever. It does that very well, but again, it doesn't connect to anything. It lives in isolation, and so again, moving up the sophistication scale into courses, courseware, and collections, we move up through applying concepts of gamification, and we start to think through, how are we using AI? How is the machine or the resource helping to learn the learner? And we know that learning the learner is the teacher's first job. And so if we're using resources that have teaching ability, then they should be learning the learner and being able to provide some level of feedback and begin to help them navigate and make some decisions. So that applet and app, it's down at the bottom level, but at the very top, we're starting to talk about AI, right? We're starting to talk about any of the VR, all of those predictive models that you see in a lot of the great resources today. So that's critical to understand, because then as you start to specify resources and evaluate them for teaching ability, things that are in that concept and applet app are going to be a lot of little bits of Lego, but they're going to cause a need for connectivity. And it's important that as we build an ecosystem, that we try to stay up in that more sophisticated, more interactive level of resource, because that's where we start to see learners exercising some agency, and that's critical. So at any point, raise a paw digitally in the chat and add some commentary or questions, because I'm just going to sort of breeze through this, and then we'll hopefully pause at the end for a lot more discussion. So this is building upon that. So building upon the understanding of how to think about what type of resource I'm experiencing or using, to how do I evaluate those resources within a scale. Now I want to be able to place that information into sort of the larger mashup of what's going on and what the system, the ecosystem might look like. And so this is a pretty complex diagram, but it does a good job of pictorializing what's going on out there. And so from listening to other presenters, it's very clear that we're still in the lots of stuff range in a lot of systems, right? And so a lot of the school systems have jumped in with both feet. They may or may not have buy-in from everybody, but boy, they've got a lot of stuff. And so there's a lot of things to think about. And as a leader, this is absolutely the big picture, right? This is where you, as any of the executive level in a school or a principal, a building leader, you have to start understanding some of these things, because now that's part of your responsibility. It's the world that we've created and are living in. And so there's levels of sort of consideration for things like portals, right? Platforms, rostering, any of the single sign-on stuff, SSO, all of that stuff. You need to start thinking about that. Those are all things that your IT and your teaching and learning crew are really starting to wrestle with. What does this look like, and how is this relative to an experience? Because that's ultimately what we're doing. things like security, right? Data warehouse, learning lore, learning object repository. I love when people call it a lore because that has a completely different meaning for me. And so then we start thinking about then software systems, right? And all of that other stuff withstanding. Now we're starting to talk about SIS. We're starting to talk about testing things. We're looking for data dashboards. We've got platforms for PD. We've got fiscal management. We've got any number of office suites, right, within a system. Hopefully, people have winnowed that down. But you see it, right? You see some folks using Google and some folks using Microsoft, and they're in the same shop. So, yikes! And then we turn over, we flip over into what we've laid out for teachers and students in that little colorful diagram right there. So all that stuff is sort of swirling around the experience of learning and impacting it. And then we've purchased a whole bunch of stuff for them to use. And whether we understand the scale and the complexity or sophistication of those resources, we've dumped them all into the ecosystem. And thank goodness for somebody like ClassLink, because that helps to coordinate all of that stuff. But you can see that by the grade level, things are changing, right? And they're shifting and changing, and who knows where they are and what's going on. And that's overwhelming, right? And so we need some control around those things. And we need to be able to think about now the logistics. And this was created at a time when that digital load wasn't yet truly identified, and it was felt, but it was not yet illustrated in quite this manner. And so what's missing, and what has been missing, and what you see in the top right corner there is things like auto cohorting, right, and auto calendaring and live interaction. When we're starting to think about how is a learner navigating this experience, and how are we creating a rich experience that uses these tools, and then also allows the machine to start doing what machines do really well. And how do we create a hybrid model for that, or an architecture for personalized learning? And that's critical. That's this type of a diagram, obviously oversimplified, but this is also in your mind as a leader, always moving toward, how can I use these tools now that I've paid great money for? How can I use those to help student achievement? That was something that came up in the last discussion from Krista Phillips from the Bronx. Technology enhancements, and I wrote this down, have not resulted in student achievement or growth. And then there was a decision matrix behind that, right? Well, that decision matrix, lo and behold, includes a bunch of this stuff. And so understanding that as a leader is critical. The next thing that you have to understand as a leader, as you shift forward in this transformation, is common vocabulary. And common vocabulary, as we all know, in terms of change management, is critical. If we're all sort of nodding but yet using different language, then that complicates things infinitely. And so this EduJedi dictionary has been developed over several years. A new edition or an updated version is coming out very soon. And it's available on the Learning Council website. But I'm going to go very quickly through this, because you're going to want to go back to it. You're going to want to at least download that and spend some time with your counterparts in the teaching and learning and IT side, and use this in your executive team meetings, and use this in your leadership team meetings at the building level, because this is what we're talking about. So the EduJedi dictionary is broken into categories that you can see there. These all describe characteristics of resources and frameworks and systems, and these are things that every leader must be mindful of and must understand. And it doesn't mean that you have to go out and study the book because there's going to be an exam. The exam is going to be real time, and the test is going to be whether or not your system operates smoothly. And so understanding the vocabulary is going to be critical. Whoops, I skipped by one, but this is examples. So these are examples of what you'll see in there. And so the gating is thrown in there because this is a particularly juicy topic, right? Because this means that you're either artificially placing a ceiling on a learner, or you're using gating in order to help students move forward at their own pace. And this is one of those things that you have to understand relative to resources that you're providing or recommending. What does gating look like in those resources? Can kids move forward at their pace if you want them to? So another example, hostile characteristics, we know what those are. They pop up, they're annoying, but yet they can throw a wrench into a cleverly designed experience. Modals, another example. So each one of these really goes into it, and it's very simple, right? It's easy to understand. It's not tech speak. It's not strictly ed speak, but it's a nice combination of both. It really helps you and your counterpart in the IT world to start to speak the same language. And so as an administrator and as an executive on the teaching and learning side, I had a prearranged marriage with my counterpart in IT, and my chief information officer, and we walked arm in arm, and that was a directive from our superintendent at the time. And as we moved our entire system into the digital learning and experiential world, bringing along all the most effective practices in teaching and learning, it was critical that myself and my counterpart, CIO counterpart, we talked the same talk, and we were seen in the same places, and we had a slightly different skew on things, but we could nod and understand. And I knew enough about SSO, and he knew enough about engagement practices that we could walk classrooms together, right? We were present in the buildings, and that was critical. That was a responsibility, right? And so I'm gonna leap from there into these standards, because this is kind of what we're talking about. Some standards were developed for administrators, for teachers, and for kids, and these were developed. This is a draft. These are developed by the EduJedi and the Learning Council, and a number of fantastic educators across the country who are sharing their expertise, sharing their experience, willing to take risks, willing to help to build a resource that we can all use in order to move forward much more mindfully. And so these standards for administrators, they really are talking about those new professional responsibilities, and it's centered around selection and management of digital curriculum and systems. So resources, infrastructure. How are you thinking in terms of all of the bits and pieces that we looked at in that last diagram, where things are swirling around and there's sort of a brain dump of things going on. And what does that mean for you as a principal? What does it mean for you as a CNI director? What does it mean for you as a CIO? What does it mean for you as a superintendent? One of the questions that I always ask my colleagues when I'm working out in the field is how is your executive team with this change, and how well do they understand what's happening, and how well do they understand the needs of in the classroom, and how well do they understand their own learning needs and their component within this larger change? Because that's, sometimes, like I said before, sometimes that gets overlooked, and we know from experience that the systems that have made the most successful and sustaining changes start at the top, and they start with parallel learning, right? They start with experiences at the executive and superintendent level that then parallel what's going on within the building leadership level, that then parallel what's going on within the instructional coach team and the teacher level, and then on down to the student level. You should see the red line, right? There should be a red line between all of those, and for leadership to understand very clearly what it is that they're biting off and moving into. So these standards are talking about that. Some examples of those standards, and there's more within that dictionary. So the institution weighing impact of the free resource, right? So actual cost. This is beyond the dollar amount or your subscription rate. This is what is the whole ball of wax, right? What are we talking about in terms of legal language? What are the implications for data security? What are we talking about in terms of contracts, and where do we sit as a system in our understanding of what the real implication of those contracts is? A lot of times those contracts, they're pretty dense. And I remember when we first started in my system moving toward subscription based and digital resource adoption versus paper. It was like dump the Legos out because this was brand new, and there weren't a lot of models to follow. I mean, a lot of folks were doing some great work early on. A lot of us stole and borrowed a lot of that work, and that's how you do it. But it is important that you read those licenses and understand the legal language. And if you don't understand it, great time to grab your legal team, if you have one, or whoever is representing the legal aspect of what you do as a system. Grab that person and say, I want to understand this, and also I need for you to understand it. One of the things that we encountered was that our legal team didn't truly understand what we were talking about from the teaching and learning and IT and information technology side, so that they would read a legal document in one way and interpret it in a way that really had no relevance to how the real user is going to use this. So a lot of conversations early on in this whole thing were helping the legal teams to understand, whether it's an outside office or or it's your internal legal team, helping them to understand, what does this mean, and how are we identifying, and what does that mean, and beyond just the legal term, but in the context of a learning resource, what are we talking about? And as the CAO, yep, it's your it's your responsibility to know that stuff. And yes, you absolutely have to have your IT crew take a look at that as well, because guess what? They're going to spot things that you didn't. And it's important that all eyes are on this stuff, so that we can keep kids' information safe, so that we know that resources are going to work within the ecosystem, stuff like that. And that's all really, really important. The fact that school systems are targeted by cyber attack right now, right? When did that start happening? Well, it did. And guess what? If you weren't paying attention and you hadn't considered data ownership and security, then gosh, you're a target. And it's not if, it's when. So that's important. So there's standards relative to that responsibility. The other section is also critical in terms of how we create those structures and systems to promote personalization and leverage student agency and learner identity and build those aspects. And so this talks about this. The standards also talk about, as it's listed here, progressively working toward full individualization and personalization, right? So we're talking about the student's ability to, and how is your system explicitly planning for and moving forward toward those things. And if you're not moving toward personalized learning, then you're behind. And what we've talked about in terms of learner choice, and we've talked about things changing and people, students leaving public ed and sort of gravitating toward other models. It's because we haven't yet made that leap. And if your system hasn't really started talking about that and wrestling with it and wrestling with the definition, right? You have common vocabulary around that. There's a definition in the dictionary for personalized learning, use it. And so find that common definition and build your system around that, and start thinking about that first bullet. How does all this other stuff impact personalized learning in my system, and how am I helping to build student agency? So there's some standards around that. And then there's also standards around working toward digital pathways, right? And so this talks about workflow. And I mentioned logistics previously. What we are talking about is workflow, right? It's like Amazon. It's like any of the larger logistical organizations that move things and people around. That's ultimately where we're headed, right? We're headed toward a much more flexible, sort of a learner-centric type of a structure. And in fact, I heard, in fact, our ViewSonic friend was talking about zones for learning, right? And I thought that's interesting because that's really, you sometimes see that, but are you, is it explicit, and is it planful, and is it across the system? And is there equitable access to that type of an experience? I remember some classrooms that I would step into, or school buildings that I would step into, and what you would see in one room across the room from another was vastly different, right? And so those two groups of kids were having different experiences, and it's possible that one was much more personalized than the other, and one might have been much more engaging than the other, and there might have been higher levels of student agency in one classroom than the other, and that's within a grade level, within a building. And so what that tells me is that system wasn't thinking systemically, right? They weren't thinking about workflow. They weren't thinking about how do all of our learners move through this thing. And that's critical. That's an important consideration. It even applies to things like facilities, right? If you're one of the schools who's lucky enough to have community support for upgrading buildings or building new ones, always bring those folks in. Read the third teacher. Read some of the books and some of the literature and research around how environment and environmental design impacts the ability to personalize learning experiences, because that's about workflow, right? How do students move through? If you're gonna create a flexible learning environment, and you should, but yet your physical space is built in the Green Mile, and you've got doors opening into a windowless corridor, and you expect kids to move around and have some flexibility. It's really hard. It's hard. It can be done, but it's really hard, and that's considerations around workflow. It's something that has to be considered. So dig into that. That's just 3 examples of some large concepts that show up in these standards for administrators. The teachers also have some standards, and these are also, and I know people are thinking, oh my gosh, we can't throw another thing at teachers. Well, we can, and we have to. And I think Lonnie was mentioning earlier, it's hard work. It is hard work, right? This is hard work. It's not easy. No one ever said it was going to be easy. We're not going to flip a switch and things are going to shift and change. That just isn't. That's not real, right? So we have to accept that we need some guidelines. We need some direction to help us understand where we're going and how we're going, right? So that we can start to build in that feedback and start to know, yeah, I think I'm heading in the right direction. I think I'm moving in a positive direction. I'm doing that mindfully and explicitly. I'm not just stumbling forward and by happenstance lucking into some things, because that's not sustainable. So the teacher standards really talk about professional responsibilities for composition and systems. They're talking about learning design. They're talking about student oversight. What I picked up in the ViewSonic presentation was that one of the zones was a teacher who had a dashboard up and was monitoring progress within the system. That's interesting to me, because that's what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about just making sure that students are on task, or that they're engaged, or that they're in a small group, or whatever, right? All of those things are expected and should be happening. And yet there's an oversight and a monitoring type of a function that exists, and that can be made easy, or it can be made hard. I heard one teacher say, gosh, I feel like almost my entire life right now is spent looking at dashboards and watching needles and dials move. And that was said with some sadness, right? And a little bit of angst, because is that really their job? Well, it's part of their job. It is, and it always has been. We've always been progress monitoring. Whether it's a notebook or not, we've always had the responsibility to monitor the progress of our learners and learn the learner. And now we have some resources that can help do that a little bit more easily and probably quicker, right? We just have to start learning how to do that. So one of oops, I skipped over our teacher one. So our teacher standards, there's, in the same way that there's example that I shared some examples in there for administrators, teachers are very similar, and they really start to talk about how am I using the bits of Lego, all of the things that are now thrown into the ecosystem, how am I going to use that to build an experience. And I'm going to share the EduJedi model for learning experience design, and it will speak directly to that. So it's going to harken back to how do I use those tools and bits and pieces and help them to become a meaningful experience. The students also have some standards, and this is responsibility that we know doesn't just come naturally. And in the same way that many aspects of student agency don't just happen, we have to actually help learners to know what agency is and then how to exercise it. The standards for digital literacy also require some teaching, right? So you have to be mindful about teaching these standards to kids. It's what they need to know and learn and know how to do. And so it really talks about how do I, as an individual, find, evaluate, compose, and leverage platforms and resources, and how do I know what I need to know, and how do I know what I need, and so that's going to mean that I have maybe a section of learning around just a tool and how to understand the tool, and that means that you're going to have to slow down in the classroom. I see a lot of folks just sort of blazing through and expecting that resources just are and can be simply used, turned on and used, and that's actually not true. They actually have to be understood in context, and they have to be understood for their specific purpose, right? If you've got one of those app level resources and it's just a spelling app, where does that fit? Where do I put that as a learner? When do I use that? Should I be spending the majority of my time with that? Probably not. And so where does that fit within the experience, and how do I know what the expectations are? Because those clear expectations within the design are going to help the learner to move forward and be successful. And that's what we do. We create opportunities for success, and we create opportunities for failing forward. So all of these standards will sort of make sense as we move into some new models. So I'm gonna scoot into the EduJedi model, and this was developed by the EduJedi with educators, and the Learning Council came up with this as a resource for systems to use as they develop those infrastructures for supporting personalization. And so on this particular diagram, you can see a couple of different models. And so Eddy's model, there's a number of models, right? Eddy's is just one of them. It's probably 45 years old, maybe more. It's perfectly fine. It's not bad. And yet it may or may not be helping us to move into the next iteration of what we need to be doing in terms of designing learning experiences. So you can see that the Eddy's model was designed around the teacher, right? There's an analysis, there's development, design, implementation, and eval. All of those things are primarily relative to the teacher's activity and what's happening there. And so it doesn't as much talk about the learner, right? It starts talking about organization and learner goals and the problem being solved, and that's all identified by the teacher. And then you move into development, and that's content creation. And so you're creating the content. Sure, you might be opening a curricular resource, and that's the thing that you're going to use. However, the nature of this model is that creation, and while creativity is good in this instance, it is not as learner centric as it could be. The design is really diving into the structure of the course, and that's a little bit different in the EduJedi model that we'll look at below that. And then implementation really talks through organizing the start, date, times, location, more physical aspects of it. What are the physical things that are going to happen within this lesson, and then evaluation. And so this is your assessment. This is learner feedback. This is any sort of measurement that you're doing to take a look at effectiveness of the lesson, but then also effectiveness of the learning. But yet it's fairly clinical, right? It's not super organic. On the bottom of this diagram, you'll see the EduJedi model, and it has 2 rows, and that's specific and it's intentional because you can think of now 2 different aspects of what your design is going to need to incorporate, right? We've got a logistics or a workflow design level or layer, and we've got a discovery design layer. And one of those is relatively teacher centric, and the other one is teacher student centric or learner centric. And those combine into sort of a nice little peanut butter cup of learning design, right? And so we start looking through the lens of logistics, and we look at scope, right? We're setting goals, we're selecting the standards to be covered, including the standards for digital literacy, right? And there's a number of those out there. But those also need to be considered in this. We move over to idea curation, right? The mapping is, how are we curating ideas? We're not in creation mode, we're curating. We don't have to wonder, we can Google, and there's a lot of great stuff out there. We have to know which ones are good and which ones are not going to be helpful, and we have to be able to use the tools and resources that we have, right? So we're onboarding, right? We're assigning appropriate levels within resources to build this experience, and the Lego pieces we're using are the right ones. In the design layer or section, we're talking about that selection and assessments, but then aligning those with live activities, right? So we're not always going to be on the screen. Technology is a tool. Technology should be like air, and it should be there when you need it, and you shouldn't even have to think about it. But it's not all screen time. We know that, and we have to build in the interactive and the more tactile experiences. We have to start using inquiry, right? We have to use inquiry, and a lot of those PBL concepts have to be built into our designs. And this is where we align those types of things with our digital resources and ideas and concepts in that larger map. And then how are people going to move through that? How are they going to start navigating and modulating within that? And then implementation is really talking about sequencing or coding that lesson, right? Or you're expecting that someone's going to move through this experience in a certain manner. What is the sequence of things going to be? You're putting yourself in the place of the learner and thinking about, what is this going to feel like? What are the what if points, and what are the decision points within this that are going to cause a student to go left versus right? And what if they choose to go right but should be going left? Then what? And then you start thinking about intersections in that next row over, or column over. And this is where, within that mind map, you're thinking, okay, now I'm going to place a human interaction in these places within that larger experience. And I'm going to think about, what's the flexible learning environment that they're going to be within that allows them to go to a completely different physical place to do something, and then come back to this spot or another spot when they need to? And how will they know that? How will they know that they need to get to that spot? Are we going to use calendaring? Are we going to use auto calendaring? Because remember from that previous slide, that's one of those things, right? That's one of the workflow elements and the logistical elements that it's time to start thinking about, right? How do you auto cohort, and what are you going to use for that? Do you have a system for that? It doesn't have to be fancy, but your design should be considering that. And then where do we end in terms of continuation or termination? Does the experience end here and we begin a completely new one? Does it end here and then continue and progress beyond that? And is that specific to the kid? And how will they know when they're ready to move on to a different experience, or simply deepen, or maybe go back? And that's all part of the design. So at the bottom row, however, and we have the discovery design segment of the model. And so in the scope range, what we're talking about is really teachers and users or learners identifying targets, right, and identifying goals, and as the example on the slide says, identifying questions, right, and posing questions. We know that inquiry and asking questions, asking higher level questions. Think of Costa. Those higher level questions lead to deeper learning and deeper understanding. They also lead to, interestingly enough, curiosity, right, and engagement, and all of the things that we really wish upon our students. That sort of questioning and inquiry, it leads them there. And so your design should include all of that, right? It should include a lot of those problem-based learning concepts and that sort of structure. The mapping, right? The mapping column talks about user or learner discovery, and how within the map and the design of this, where is that discovery going to take place, and what do they do with it, and where do they go from there? Which leads you then over into the design segment here, the design column. And this is where we're talking about thesis, right? We're saying, well, this is what I think, and here's where I'm predicting something, or I'm beginning to develop proof accumulation or proofs or examples of how I'm going to show my learning, and make that mindful, make that explicit, and help in your design to guide the learners toward that. The implementation phase or column really talks about how do you refine that through revision, right? And we know that iterative thinking, again, is one of those very positive and impactful skills. It doesn't come naturally, but it definitely is something to design into the experience. How do you help learners to iterate upon their designs? And that design can be it can be simple, right? It doesn't have to be a physical thing. It can be simply revising some thinking or moving through some iterative steps. And then the intersection and logistics is where how will I know that I am that I need to be in a certain place, and how do I, in the design, how do I get the interaction that I need as a student or as a learner, and as the teacher, then how have I created that ability or that opportunity? And then again, in column number 6, how do I know when I need to go back, and how can I, or am I ready to move forward? And this is where concepts around gating in your design, in your learning design, are you placing an artificial ceiling in and not allowing students to move beyond that before the rest of the class catches up or gets to that point? Or have you created no ceiling and an increasing floor, right? So we always want to increase the floor and take the ceiling off, because that means our expectations are moving up every time we move forward. So this is the model. This is the EduJedi model, and this is really, as I said before, this is talking about learning experience design, and it's not talking about planning for teaching. It isn't. It's solely focused on the learner's experience, and can help to begin to frame those experiences and take all of that contextual information that we talked about in terms of identifying types of resources, and dump that in here, because this is where you start to use it. So this is an example of some of that, or some of this that was an experience that was planned, and this particular one is around math, and so the scope, the district's pacing is being used for objectives. There are state standards that are being wrapped together. Things are not being done in isolation. They're being done in conjunction with other things. They're contextualized, right? So we always have an eye for integration, and that's important, but this is where that happens, right? Then we're going to jump into mapping, and you've got, this never happens in school today, right? 50% of the students are remote. What? No, that's today. That's our reality. Yeah, we do have those. We've got those mixed classes. And so what are you going to do? And you're curating ideas and mapping. What's that going to look like? This is you thinking about that. And so some of the kids are going to be with you. Some of them are not. Do you have the ability to engage them in different places at high levels and toward similar types of learning objectives that build agency? courseware, the design in this example, courseware is being used, and you go into the courseware and select the modules, and you're picking out which pieces are going to fit where, and you're placing them along a timeline, and you know that there's decisions that are going to be made, and those are sequenced, right, so that the students can self-navigate the path and know when a human interaction is indicated. So you're thinking about that. You're thinking about what pieces do I use when and where and why. The implementation example in this one is setting the first step, thinking about login. How are they going to log into all their things? Do you have a resource like ClassLink? Do you have a common dashboard? Do you have single sign-on? If your kids are littles, do you have an easy way for them to do that, right? Do you have the badge that you can just put in front of their Chromebook and off they go? And so how does that happen? And then thinking about those intersections and logistics, right? The live teaching moment, when does that happen? Those things still exist and they're very necessary. And yet how do you combine that within the larger experience? And then in this example, you're going to terminate the experience when they get to a certain step. Then they're done and they've shown what they know. They may have had to go back and redo some things or re-understand some things or go back a little more deeply. And maybe you trigger a badge, or it's a mark, or it's a high five, or it's an animated squid, or whatever it is that you're using in order to give these to give the points, or to give the clearance that you have understood and can move forward. So that's just one example, and we've seen a bunch of different ones of those, but this is we're always looking for examples of how people are using this, and we've got some good ones. I mean, there's some districts across the country that are now experimenting and using this type of a model, if not this very same one, to do some really interesting things, and it's becoming more system based. All of these things that I just sort of breezed through are available on the Learning Council website, and so we're doing a lot more development of these standards. We're refining them continuously. We're taking feedback from folks who are trying them and saying, gosh, this section over here, we thought it made sense, but the more we dig into it, I think it needs to say this different thing, or could we add, or could we pare down, things like that. Those are all very important. And the idea of any standard set is to not make it nominal, but to make it functional, and for it to not be a waste of time, because nobody has time to waste, and to make it helpful. And so that's the whole goal. In terms of responsibilities, there's new responsibilities, right? And this sort of skips over the top 5 of those that we just spent almost an hour talking about. The responsibility is for designing learning, and it's for designing learning experiences. It's not for planning teaching. That's different. Our administrators and leaders, administration, we've got new responsibilities that include some things that you may not have thought about. When I was in admin school, we talked a lot about legal, but we didn't necessarily talk about contracts and resource contracts and digital resource contracts. We didn't, because that wasn't happening at the time. So those types of things, you got to understand them. And it's important that your CFO understand, right? Your CFO is the money person. And if they don't really understand why you're doing what you're doing and how you're doing what you're doing, then how can they ever support that? And then maybe they don't. And there you have a conflict. And that's how systems tend to splinter. And that's unfortunate, because who gets hurt? The teachers and the kids. And that's never appropriate. Teachers, new responsibilities for creating and for curating and for designing within and with resources. And learners, very similar. Your responsibility is knowing what resources you have at your disposal, why they do what they do, and how then to choose the one that is going to work best for your needs. That means that you're going to need to know what you need, and that's all That's all the responsibility at that whole. If we took a look at 2, 3, and 4, that last one, how does a learner know what they need to know? That flows all the way to the top. And so learners can be adults and they can be the kids. So we all have responsibility for that. And then finally, user interface and user experience. How is this changing, right? What new responsibilities do we have in terms of understanding that interface, understanding the experience, and then understanding the confluence of tech and curricular resource, because that's very that's very real, and we're moving. I spoke with somebody who is in the paper curriculum resource or curricular resource field, and that's hard, right? Because now systems have moved solely to digital, and the incidence of the old school pallets of books and workbooks and consumables showing up on the doorstep, and then you sort of dealing them out like cards, and then they may or may not sit up on the shelf for the next 3 years. Those days are gone, right? Those days don't exist, and so we're in the subscription model, and so that's that's all about the experience. That's all about the confluence of those two things. So I want to open it up to some questions. I want to also say thanks to everybody who has been here to participate in this particular discussion. And I want to make sure that we have an open door and an understanding that by all means, speak up today or speak up another day, but speak up and give this stuff a try, because this is going to help, and we can all help to move everyone forward together. So, hi, Lonnie.
Hey, well, that was awesome. I just jumped back on in case there were questions. I'm watching for questions or chats. Obviously, we'll be having 2 new guest speakers join us in just a little bit. But this, I want to update everyone on the work. So I think we've had 18 meetings so far of the EduJedi over the summer. Some of them were back to back. It was kind of arduous. Hearing from people all over the nation about the complexity that they're in, I have 2 primary takeaways. One is this work is absolutely essential to moving the ball forward. People are up to their neck in complexity, and they need to bring order not only to their thinking, but put in normatives like these definitions and these standards, and inculcate people in how you design differently. Because, most teachers were not ever trained to be instructional designers. Yep. That's true of a good 90% of the population of teachers. But then as they waded into digital, they left the textbooks behind, and it's a mess. It's really, there was superintendents telling us they had teachers in their office crying at the end of summer, like, we couldn't get it all done.
Right.
So to us, just
crazy.
Buy us stuff,
Buy us some stuff. We need more stuff. That's not what they need. Yeah. So what I was talking to a colleague not too long ago, and what they were wondering about was, and this was a retired administrator that I ran into, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that I'm not there." I'm like, I don't know, it's kind of cool right now. And what came up was that the simply dumping in things didn't improve, and what you're saying, it created more complexity, but it also highlighted poor teaching practice, and so as soon as people ditched the textbook and then thought that they were jumping into something brand new, and the poor teaching and learning habits were amplified as soon as we did that, which is remarkable and an opportunity at the same time. And so, we know the rock star teachers. They were rock stars before digital. They're still rock stars, and they made the leap. They made the transformation, and those guys are my heroes. Yeah. Because they did this thing, and that's fantastic. And we've got administrators that have done the same thing, right? We've got the whole spectrum of them. Yep. And that's remarkable.
Yeah, it really is. We're in a moment, right? Like, this is literally a transition moment. It's in many ways a revolution. And so I would just comment that my other takeaway was being shocked as leaders describe the depth of not understanding among their teachers. Where we would bring up, well, like, why aren't they just doing this? They're like, what? We barely got them to be able to use Word or Google, you know,
right.
We barely did that. And
Right.
now you're talking about workflow, tagging files correctly so that people can find them,
Yep.
the construct of a digital lesson versus a non-digital, the whole thing is so deep. And so we're going to keep plodding forward, obviously, with EduJedi leadership standards and everything else. We'll probably be doing this for 5 to 10 years.
Right.
Just
Easy.
getting people aware, because so many, 50% of the market joined the digital fray. And they're just, they're still in shell shock, just entering this fall, the fall of this year with their kids. And then, then they're told, oh, there's another surge. We got to be out again. It's like people are just generally freaked out all the time. And then this complexity.
Right. Yeah. And we'll get to the other side. But I think it's, it's increasingly more important that we do this together. I mean, if there was ever a time where collaboration and stealing and borrowing ideas and sharing ideas was important, this is that time, because everyone is in this morass, and there are clear leaders, right? There are leaders, and we know the districts that are way out ahead, and they started the work back when we were just sort of whispering about it, right?
Yeah.
Back 10, 15 years ago, they started out and they were like, yeah, I think maybe this is where we should be going. They did it. And so they've felt a lot of the pain already, that these newer districts in the fray are currently experiencing. And we want to know from those guys, right? That's what these EduJedi, the EduJedi have done that, right? The majority of the folks within the EduJedi rank have felt the pain at some point in their past, recent or not, and they know the pain points, and they can share the information about, you know what, here's what to look out for. And I think that's critical. If you're right, if there was a time for us to band together and coalesce, this is the time. This is the time for sure, because we're not going backwards. We can't. We're not. That ship has sailed.
Yeah, like Yasna Alafendik from Garland ISD said last week when we were live in Dallas, and it was reiterated again when we were in Atlanta with all those administrators. I think we have like 10 different of the big districts. A couple were small. Yasna said, normal, get that word out of your vocabulary. There is no return to normal. Normal's gone. Right. It's over.
Right.
So now let's not even have that word.
Right.
She was like, get over that word.
Totally.
And by the way, hi, Stephanie. I know you're there. I'm going to get to you in a sec. Hi.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I think normal, the way that people use the word normal refers to the past, when in fact normal is today, right? Yeah. And it's tomorrow, and it'll be slightly different the next day, but that's also going to be normal. And it's fascinating. Awesome.
Yeah.
It's a good time.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. This was
thank
awesome.
You. Yep.
And so for all attendees that are on today that listen to Chris, you just earned a digital learning experience badge granted to you. That's the look of the badge. It'll be in nostory.com. You need to claim it, though. You need to have an account, and you need to let Doug or the EduJedi Leadership Society know that you're in there, so we can give you a badge. We can't just email it to you, because if you're not in the system, you won't be able to retrieve it, kind of a thing. So you are badge. All right. So thank you very much, Chris.